Good morning. Thank you. I guess it's my job to put a fine point on the issues that were mentioned by Mark and gone into a little bit more by Tim, which I appreciate very much. And that is this whole issue of rising sea level, climate change, and dead pool. So without further ado, I want to give you a little bit of background on the way in which the state's water systems have developed over time. So the first major project was the Los Angeles Aqueduct back in 1908, went up through the Owens Valley to Mono Lake. They took a little more water than they should have, had to give some of it back. And then the Hetch Hetchy project to the city and county of San Francisco that serves most of the peninsula in the valley next to Yosemite. And then East Bay Mud developed their McCollum project in 1924. Comanche and Pardee reservoirs were part of this major project. The second major water supply project for the Los Angeles area was the Colorado River Aqueduct. 4.4 million acre-foot contract with Bureau of Reclamation. Again, they took a little bit more water than they were supposed to. It happened to belong to the state of Arizona, who sued, and they had to give that water back. And then the Central Valley Project, which in Northern California is Shasta and Trinity Reservoirs and Folsom Lake. Back in 1937, this got started, and it was about this time that the concept of area of origin finally came into the conversation. There were these imperialistic water development projects that were taking water from the area where it is, in the Sierras and the Cascades, and exporting it to the major metropolitan areas and farming areas of the state. And Northern California said, hey, wait a minute, we're going to need water supply for our future development as well. And there was a grand deal struck, and the deal was that the exporters, people exporting from this region, taking the water south, could take the surplus, but they had to leave enough water for Northern California to meet its future goals as well. And so with that, the Central Valley Project, which is of course the Bureau of Reclamation that operates it, was able to move forward. And then the final project, which also uses the Delta as a major piece of conveyance, is the State Water Project, which as you heard is the largest state water project in the United States. It's also the third major water supply project for Southern California. It was built in 1960. So just a little bit about the area of origin. When Pat Brown was Attorney General back in 1955, he was asked to give his opinion about the watershed protection statutes, which at that time had been passed by the state legislature. And he said, these statutes create a right to water which is paramount to other uses, even though those waters may be put first to use outside the area, or even if the water is the greatest use of the water, even if the greatest need is outside the area or it's first put to use outside of the area, it nevertheless protects these water supplies for the area of origin. So we've got these protections. We appreciate it. So the major trends, the mega trends that are driving our issues today are growth, environmental regulation, and climate change. The growth, I'm sure we're all familiar with. Since 1940, we've had about a 5 times increase in population in the state. We're approaching 40 million. Population has doubled since 1970. And with this has been a steadily increasing need for water supply. At the same time, since 1992, we've seen quite a bit of water dedicated to the environment, and not that it doesn't need it, but the result has been about a 38% reduction in the amount of water supply available from state and federal projects. So while we've had increasing demand, we've had decreasing supply because of environmental regulation. So Tim did a pretty good job in the air of describing this, but I want to go into a little bit more detail about how the system works. So this is the legal delta, and here's Folsom Lake, and the water comes down the Sacramento River. And the objective of these projects is to get the water to Clifton Court Forebay. Clifton Court is at the south corner of the delta. Once they've got it there, they've got it captured. They can put it into the pumps and take it down the canals that you've seen along I-5 headed towards Southern California. So the water comes down the Sacramento River, as I described, and then it has to go down the Sacramento River all the way to the confluence of the San Joaquin, and then go back up the San Joaquin River in order to continue its way down to Clifton Court Forebay. And these are some of the reverse flows that Mark was talking about. There's a delta cross channel, which was kind of the first attempt at a peripheral canal, if you will. And when environmental conditions are right, they can take water down the east side of the delta, which helps a lot. The San Joaquin River comes in from the south, but there's not much flow and it's not real high quality, so that really doesn't help. And then once they've got it, they take it to Southern California, as I said. So this is a Google Earth picture. There's the Clifton Court Forebay, and here's the water going down the Sacramento back up to San Joaquin to get into the system. And here's the saltwater situation. So the bay is all saltwater. In Sassoon Bay is where this X2 mixing zone is. X2 is literally where the saltwater is 2 parts per thousand. So that's where the saltwater and freshwater mix. And the issue here is that if it gets much farther east, you're going to have a problem because that saltwater is going to get into that reverse flow of the San Joaquin. You're going to contaminate the water supply, and you're not going to have a water supply because nobody's pumping salt water to meet demands. So this issue of climate change, we need to understand a little bit about this history. Here's 400,000 years of air temperature data taken from ice cores. And as you can see, it's been warm and cold. There's an oscillating pattern here. But for the last 10, 12,000 years, we've been in a warm cycle. If you remember your geology, 10,000 years ago was the end of the last ice age. So during this previous period of 30 or 40,000 years, we took so much of the Earth's water and stacked it up in glaciers that it sheared off Half Dome, right? So here's a little farther out Google Earth picture. These are the Farallon Islands. It isn't real bright, but 10,000 years ago you could walk to the Farallon Islands. These erosion patterns you see, this was the coast of California, and the Pacific Ocean was out here, hundreds of feet below where it is now. And the point of this slide is that we've had rising sea levels for the last 10,000 years. This is not a new trend. Here's the last 100 years of data on rising sea level. The 19-year mean has risen about 8 inches in the last 80 years. So sea level is rising. It's been rising for a long time. It's continuing to rise. I saw an article in National Geographic that there's about, if all of the rest of the ice on Earth melted, sea level would rise another 216 feet. So we're not done with this process yet. So again, if you're the State Water Project or the CBP and you're trying to get water to Clifton Court Forebay and sea level is continuing to rise, this is your future. That X2 is going to inevitably get pushed farther to the east, and you're going to lose your investments. So all of the investments that they've made to build Shasta and Oroville and Folsom are going to be lost. That's why they're willing to invest in the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. So here's Clifton Court Forebay, and this is the twin tunnels that they're going to move the intakes upstream on the Sacramento River, up above the rising sea level, away from the 57 endangered species in the Delta. That's all a good thing. It would allow them to increase their winter and spring diversions, which would be excellent. The problem here is that there's no resolution of the increasing delta salinity and the conflict that causes with the ESA issues. So the assumptions in the Bay Delta Conservation Plan is that by 2060, sea level is going to rise 17 inches. But they've also assumed that all of the existing Delta water quality standards have to continue to be met, that there'll be no change. This is an impossible situation, as Tim mentioned. If the ocean's 17 inches higher, how are you going to keep the salt in the current location? And the answer is you can't. So for Folsom Reservoir, the most remarkable thing about Folsom is that it's small in comparison to the size of the drainage basin. So it's only a little under 1 million acre feet, but the average annual runoff for the basin is 2.6 million acre feet. So the Bureau of Reclamation has a very difficult time managing this annual cycle reservoir. They have to keep enough empty space behind it to manage flood flows when we get high flood flows. Sacramento is one of the least flood-protected metropolitan regions in the country. But at the same time, they have to keep enough water supply behind the reservoir to manage in case we have a drought, that there's adequate water for people in this region to drink, and to manage the environmental resources in the Lower American River. And this is a very difficult job. Bureau of Reclamation struggles every year. This year is a particularly great example of how difficult it is. So, but you add on to that this responsibility to maintain delta salinity standards in their current location, and what you get is this. This is modeling results out of the BDCP. This is not as a result of building the tunnels. This is the no action alternative. And this is dead pool. And this is dead pool occurring more than 10% of the time. This is in Folsom in September, but it also happens in Shasta. So what's happening is sea level's rising. They're assuming that we got to meet the same delta requirements we currently do, and our reservoirs are drained by the time you get to September, at least 1 year out of 10, and remain that way for months until you get future rainfall. The local impacts are hard to overestimate. 500,000 people will be out of water for months at a time, once every decade. The Lower American aquatic ecosystem, those of us participated in the water forum, would be wiped out. And the inner delta would be flooded with salt water anyway. Because once Folsom and Shasta are empty, you've got no resources left to hold back the delta, and you've squandered the resources you have in a futile attempt to hold back the tide, and lost. So the problem from our perspective is that the objective of the BDCP was to protect the exports from rising sea level. And we think that the objective should be to find a statewide solution to rising sea level. So we need to identify the changes in regulatory requirements, operations, and infrastructure necessary to adapt to rising sea level. And for me, the obvious question is, why didn't they do this? And the answer is because this is really hard. You've got 57 endangered species, and if sea level continues to rise and saltwater moves in, some of them may not survive. And the Endangered Species Act doesn't allow you to plan for extinction. You must plan for survival of all the species. You can't do it. You've got delta farmers who were promised that they'd have fresh water forever by the Bureau of Reclamation. They can't do it. And you've got communities. You've got Antioch, Contra Costa, who take water out of the delta. What are they going to do? The problems are nearly intractable. And so that's our issue. We need a process, a wholesome process, a holistic process that looks at the regulatory policies that are going to have to adapt, change to adapting sea level, looks at how you're going to change your operation, and identifies the needed infrastructure to make these hard decisions and figure out what we're going to do. And here's my biggest issue is that we're going to need the legislature to be involved in this. The State Water Resources Control Board has got to make some very hard decisions, and it's going to be really difficult for them to do it. I suspect that the legislature is going to have to weigh in. And if 2/3 of California has already solved their problem, because they've built the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, they've got the twin tunnels in, and they no longer have a problem, because in dry years, they can go to the Owens Valley, they can go to the Colorado River, they can go to their groundwater banks, and we're left, we're the only ones needing to solve this problem in Northern California. We're going to end up not succeeding. So, as has been mentioned, we've got nearly 25,000-page draft environmental impact report coming in on November 15th. And we've got the governor. The good news is the governor is going to move forward with the statewide action plan that's been recommended by ACWA. What we're worried about is the governor has been a big supporter of building these tunnels. And if the tunnels become the #1 feature of his statewide water action plan, ahead of solving these delta issues, then we're going to have a problem with that. This is about sequencing. The ACWA swap is a great document. It deals with things in a really good way, but it's silent on sequencing because we don't have agreement about that between North and Southern California, and this is our issue. So we are circulating a letter trying to get the Delta to exercise leadership to engage in this process of coming up with a solution to Delta holistically and not simply moving forward with the company. Thank you.